The setting sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kamal Haddad's mansion in Beverly Hills, its warm light doing little to dispel the perpetual chill that seemed to permeate the vast spaces. At 52, Kamal had everything money could buy, yet the emptiness of his surroundings echoed the void within his heart. Standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, he watched as the last rays of daylight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, his reflection in the glass revealing a face marked not by years, but by solitude. The mansion, with its 23 rooms and meticulously maintained gardens, had never felt like home. It was merely another asset in his portfolio, another symbol of his success as one of the most prominent real estate developers in the country. His father's words from decades ago still rang in his ears. "A Haddad builds empires, not families." Those words had shaped his existence, driving him to create a business empire that spanned continents, yet left him standing alone in rooms too large for one person. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in, Marcus," he called. Out, recognizing his longtime friend and lawyer's distinctive pattern of knocking. The door opened, and Marcus Chen entered, his casual demeanor a stark contrast to Kamal's rigid posture. "The results from your latest checkup arrived," Marcus said, holding up a manila envelope. "Do you want to discuss them now?" Kamal turned. Away from the window, his expression unchanged. "Pour yourself a drink first, you look like you need one." Marcus moved to the crystal decanter set, pouring 2 fingers of scotch into a glass. "You know me too well." He settled into one of the leather armchairs, waiting as Kamal took his seat behind the massive mahogany desk. "Tell me," Kamal said, his voice steady despite the concern that had been gnawing at him since his last visit to the specialist. Marcus took a sip before speaking. "The doctors are concerned about the progression of your heart condition. They're recommending significant lifestyle changes and stress reduction." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "They also suggested that if you're planning any major life changes, now would be the time to consider them." Kamal's fingers drummed against the desk's polished surface, a rare display of nervousness. "My sister called yesterday, another lecture about the importance of carrying on the family name. The irony doesn't escape me. Our father never cared about family unless it served his business interests, and now everyone expects me to suddenly become the patriarch who ensures the Haddad legacy continues. Have you considered their suggestions about arranged introductions? There are plenty of suitable—" "No." Kamal's response was sharp. "I've watched too many loveless marriages in our community. I won't repeat that pattern." He stood, moving to a painting on the wall, a stark, modern piece that depicted a solitary figure in a vast landscape. "But they're not wrong about the need for an heir. The empire I've built, it needs a future beyond me." Marcus leaned forward, studying his friend's face. "What are you thinking, Kamal?" "I'm thinking there must be a more practical solution." Kamal turned back to face Marcus, his expression resolute. "The modern world offers options my father's generation never had. Surrogacy, for instance." Marcus nearly choked on his scotch. "Surrogacy? You want to have a child without the relationship part? Why not? It's efficient, controlled, and doesn't require navigating the complexities of a marriage I'm not prepared for." Kamal returned to his desk, pulling out his tablet. "I've already researched several agencies that handle these arrangements with complete discretion. Your family will have strong opinions about this," Marcus warned, though he could see the familiar determination in his friend's eyes, the same look that preceded every major business decision. "My family lost the right to dictate my choices when they sent me to boarding school at 7, Kamal replied coldly. "Besides, they care about continuation of the bloodline. This accomplishes that goal." Marcus set down his glass, choosing his next words carefully. "And what about the child? Have you thought about what it means to be a father, not just to have an heir?" For a moment, something flickered across Kamal's face. Uncertainty, perhaps fear, but it was quickly replaced by his usual mask of cool confidence. "I will. Provide everything a child needs. The best education, every opportunity, a secure future. Just like your father provided for you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Kamal's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled up a document on his tablet and turned it toward Marcus. "I want you to draw up the contracts. Standard surrogacy agreement, but with additional provisions for complete privacy and generous compensation." His tone made it clear. The previous topic was closed. "I want someone young, healthy, and intelligent. No family complications or prior surrogacy experience. And most importantly, someone who understands that this is strictly a business arrangement." Marcus recognized the futility of further argument. When Kamal Haddad made up his mind, especially about business matters, there was no swaying him. And in Kamal's mind, this was just another business transaction, perhaps the most important one of his life, but a transaction nonetheless. "I'll start working on it tomorrow," Marcus conceded, finishing his scotch. But Kamal, finding someone who meets all your criteria and is willing to enter into this kind of arrangement, it won't be easy. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Kamal replied, turning back to the window. The sky had darkened completely now, and his reflection stood stark against the glass, a solitary figure in a house built for a family he didn't know how to create. The rain fell in steady sheets over downtown Los Angeles, turning the city into a blur of neon reflections and hurried shadows. Sarah Mitchell huddled beneath the awning of a closed coffee shop, clutching her worn backpack to her chest. At 24, she had already lived several lifetimes' worth of experiences, though none of them had prepared her for where she found herself now. 3 years ago, she had been a promising pre-med student with a full scholarship, living in a comfortable apartment paid for by her parents' insurance settlement. Now she was calculating how many nights she could stretch her remaining dollars at the cheapest motel in the area. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had once dreamed of becoming a doctor, of helping others, and now she couldn't even help herself. A gust of wind drove the rain sideways, forcing her deeper under the awning. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. The coffee shop's window reflected her image, still pretty despite everything, with determined green eyes and dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked more like a college student pulling an all-nighter than someone who had spent the last few months bouncing between shelters and temporary jobs. "This isn't you," she whispered to her reflection, words she repeated to herself daily like a mantra. "This is just a chapter, not the whole story." The sound of expensive tires on wet pavement drew her attention. A black luxury sedan had pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the rain. Sarah tensed, ready to move if necessary. She had learned to be cautious of unexpected attention. The passenger window rolled down smoothly, revealing a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and an expensive suit. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern. "The shelter on 7th Street is still open for intake. I could give you a ride if you'd like." Sarah's first instinct was to decline. Street smarts had become essential to survival, but something about the man's demeanor, perhaps the way he maintained a respectful distance, made her hesitate. "How do you know about the shelter?" "I'm on their board of directors," he replied, pulling out a business card and holding it out through the window. "Marcus Chen, attorney at law. I was just leaving a meeting there." Sarah stepped forward cautiously, taking the card. The paper was thick and expensive, the embossing catching the light from nearby storefronts. Chen & Associates, Beverly Hills address, definitely legitimate. "I'm fine, really," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Just waiting for the rain to let up." Marcus studied her for a moment, noting her clear speech and the way she held herself. "You weren't always on the streets, were you?" The question caught her off guard. Most people either ignored her existence entirely or treated her with automated pity. This man was actually seeing her. "No," she admitted. "I was in college. Pre-med, actually." "What happened?" Sarah shifted her weight, considering how much to share. "Life happened. Bad investments, medical bills. By the time I realized how bad things were getting, it was too late to fix it." She left out the details. The accident that had changed everything, the way her parents' insurance money had seemed like an endless safety net until it wasn't. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Listen, I know this might sound unusual, but I may have an opportunity that could interest someone in your situation. A legitimate business proposition, completely legal and potentially very rewarding. Sarah's guard went up immediately. What kind of opportunity? One that could change your life, Marcus replied carefully. But it's not something to discuss in the rain. Let me at least buy you a proper meal, and you can hear what I have to say. No obligations. And you can walk away at any time. Sarah looked at the card again, then at her reflection in the coffee shop window. The girl staring back at her had once been brave enough to dream of medical school, of making a difference in the world. What would that girl do? There's a diner. Around the corner, she said finally. Open 24 hours. We could talk there. Marcus smiled warmly. I'll meet you there. And please order whatever you'd like. My treat. As Sarah watched the car pull away, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate kind that kept her going day to day, but real hope. The kind that came with possibilities. Whatever this opportunity was, it had to be better than standing in the rain counting spare change. The walk to the diner took less than 5 minutes, but it gave Sarah time to think. Her life hadn't always been like this. She had been raised in a middle-class family in Minnesota with parents who believed in education and hard work. The accident that took them had also taken her future, or so she had thought. The insurance settlement had seemed like enough to sustain her through college, but between medical bills, bad advice, and a series of unfortunate events, it had evaporated faster than morning dew. By the time she reached the diner, Marcus was already there, settled into a booth near the back. As Sarah slid into the seat across from him, she noticed he had ordered coffee for both of them. The warmth of the cup between her hands felt like luxury. Before we discuss anything, Marcus began, his tone professional but kind, I want you to know that what I'm about to propose is completely legitimate, though unconventional. It would require discretion and commitment on your part, but it could also provide you with the means to completely rebuild your life. Sarah wrapped her hands tighter around the coffee cup, its warmth spreading through her cold fingers. I'm listening. The fluorescent lights of the diner buzzed overhead as Marcus carefully laid out the details of the proposition. Sarah sat perfectly still, her half-eaten club sandwich forgotten on the plate before her. The words surrogacy contract and substantial compensation hung in the air between them, each carrying the weight of possibility and complication. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turbulent thoughts racing through her mind. Your client wants to have a child through surrogacy, and he's willing to pay not just for the procedure and medical care, but also provide additional compensation that would essentially... She paused, searching for the right words. That would allow you to start over, Marcus finished for her. Complete financial security, including funds for education if you choose to return to medical school, and a place to live during the pregnancy and recovery period. Sarah's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, now empty and cold. And your client, he's willing to offer all this to someone like me? Someone who's been living on the streets? Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. Sarah, in the hour we've been talking, you've demonstrated more intelligence and dignity than many people I deal with who were born into privilege. My client isn't looking for someone from a specific social class. He's looking for someone with character, intelligence, and discretion. And no family complications, Sarah added, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. Well, I certainly qualify there. You mentioned you were pre-med, Marcus said, changing the subject slightly. What was your specialty going to be? Pediatrics. Sarah smiled for the first time that evening, a genuine expression that transformed her face. I always loved working with children. The irony of this situation isn't lost on me. Marcus pulled out a thick envelope from his briefcase. This contains the preliminary agreement and a complete medical history of the intended father. Take it, read it over. There's also a prepaid phone in there. My number is programmed in. If you're interested in learning more, call me and I'll arrange a meeting with my client. Sarah's hand hesitated over the envelope. Your client, what's he like? Kamal is... Marcus paused, considering his words carefully. He's a complicated man, brilliant in business, demanding of others, but most of all of himself. He's not what most would consider warm, but he's unfailingly fair and honorable. Why isn't he married, having a child the traditional way? That's his story to tell if he chooses to, Marcus replied diplomatically. What I can tell you is that he's been successful in creating an empire, but not in creating a family. Now, with some health concerns emerging, he's decided it's time to address that gap in his life. Sarah finally took the envelope, its weight feeling somehow significant in her hands. And if I agree to meet him, what happens then? Then you both decide if this arrangement could work. You'll undergo complete medical screening, of course. There would be legal agreements, specifications about lifestyle during the pregnancy, living arrangements, privacy requirements. Marcus listed off the points professionally. But before any of that, you need to decide if this is something you're willing to consider. The diner's door chimed as a group of late-night customers entered, their laughter breaking the serious atmosphere at the booth. Sarah tucked the envelope into her backpack, her movements deliberate and careful. "You know what the strangest part is?" she said, looking up at Marcus. "A year ago, if someone had suggested something like this to me, I would have thought they were crazy, but now," she gestured vaguely at her surroundings, "now I understand that sometimes the craziest sounding options might be the most sensible ones." Marcus stood, placing enough money on the table to cover their meal several times over. "Take a few days to think about it. Get a room at a decent hotel. There's enough cash in the envelope for that. Read the documents, consider the implications. Carefully." As he turned to leave, Sarah called out, "Mr. Chen." He paused, looking back. "Thank you, not just for the opportunity, but for seeing me, really seeing me." Marcus nodded, a gentle smile crossing his face. "You know what I noticed. First, about you, Sarah. When most people are in your situation, their eyes are either angry or defeated. Yours are still full of determination. That's rare. Don't lose that, whatever you decide." After Marcus left, Sarah remained in the booth for a long time, staring at her reflection in the diner's window. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets outside glistening under the streetlights. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond day-to-day survival, completing her education, having a real home again, making something of herself. The envelope in her backpack seemed to carry the weight of all those possibilities. It also carried questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Could she carry a child for 9 months, knowing she would have to give it up? What would it be like to live in someone else's home, under their rules and scrutiny? And this man, this Kamal Haddad, what kind of father would he be? Sarah gathered her things and stepped out into the night air, its freshness clearing her head slightly. She had decisions to make, but for tonight, she would use some of the money to get a real hotel room, one with clean sheets and hot water. Tomorrow, she would read every word of those documents and begin to imagine what her life might become if she said yes to this unusual proposition. The Beverly Hills mansion loomed before Sarah like something out of a dream, its Mediterranean architecture both beautiful and intimidating. She smoothed down the simple blue dress she'd bought for the occasion, the first new piece of clothing she'd owned in months, and took a deep breath. The past week, spent in a modest but clean hotel room reading and rereading the contract, had felt like stepping into someone else's life. Now standing at these ornate gates, that feeling intensified. Inside his study, Kamal Haddad was equally unsettled, though he showed no outward sign of it. He stood at his usual place by the windows, watching as Marcus's car pulled up the circular driveway. The girl who stepped out was not what he had expected. Despite her obvious attempts to dress appropriately for the meeting, there was something untamed about her, a quiet strength that showed in the way she carried herself. "She's here," Marcus announced from the doorway, though it was unnecessary. "Are you ready?" Kamal turned from the window, his expression carefully neutral. "This isn't a social call, Marcus. It's a business meeting, nothing more." "Of course," Marcus replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Shall I show her in?" Moments later, Sarah entered the study, her green eyes taking in everything at once, the expensive artwork, the imposing desk, and finally, the man standing behind it. Their gazes met, and for a brief moment, Something electric passed between them, a recognition of two souls who had both known profound loneliness. "Miss Mitchell," Kamal said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had spent their formative years in international schools. "Please have a seat." Sarah moved to one of the leather chairs, her movements graceful despite her nervousness. "Mr. Haddad, thank you for considering me for this arrangement. You've read the contract?" He remained standing, maintaining the position of power in the room. "Every word," Sarah replied, her chin lifting slightly. "I have some questions, if you don't mind." A flicker of surprise crossed Kamal's face. Most people were intimidated by him, yet this young woman who had been living on the streets just days ago was prepared to negotiate. "By all means. The contract specifies that I would live here during the pregnancy," she began, her voice steady. "What exactly would that entail? What would be expected of me beyond maintaining my health and following medical advice?" Kamal moved around his desk, leaning against it in a slightly more relaxed pose. "You would have your own suite in the East Wing, complete privacy when you desire it, a driver at your disposal for appointments or personal errands. The only requirements would be following the medical team's recommendations and maintaining absolute discretion about the arrangement. And after the birth, you would be free to begin your new life with the agreed-upon compensation and additional funds for education, as specified in the contract." Kamal studied her face carefully. "Marcus mentioned you were studying medicine before your circumstances changed." Sarah's expression tightened slightly. "Yes, life doesn't always go as planned, does it, Mr. Haddad?" The question caught him, off guard perhaps because of the hint of shared understanding in her tone. For a moment, his carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing something more human underneath. "No," he agreed softly, "it doesn't." Marcus, who had been watching the exchange with interest, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss the medical aspects of the arrangement?" "Actually," Sarah interrupted, her gaze still locked with Kamal's, "I have a more personal question, if I may." Kamal gestured for her to continue, intrigued despite himself. "Why this way?" she asked. "Why not pursue marriage or a traditional relationship? Surely someone in your position has plenty of options." Kamal finished, a touch of bitterness entering his voice. "Yes, I'm quite aware of the many women who would be happy to marry into the Haddad family fortune. But I'm not looking for a wife. I'm looking for an heir." "A child isn't a business acquisition, Mr. Haddad," Sarah said quietly, the words out before she could stop them. The room fell silent. Marcus tensed, preparing to intervene, but Kamal's response surprised them both. Instead of anger, there was something like respect in his expression. "No," he agreed, "a child isn't. But this arrangement would provide that child with every advantage, every opportunity, and it would provide you with the means to rebuild your life. A mutually beneficial transaction, wouldn't you agree?" Sarah stood, moving to the window where Kamal had been standing earlier. The view of the manicured gardens and the city beyond was breathtaking. "When I was living on the streets," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I learned that the most valuable things can't be bought or sold. They have to be earned or given freely." She turned back to face him. "I'll do it, Mr. Haddad. Not because of the money, though. I won't pretend that isn't important. I'll do it because everyone deserves a chance at having a family, even if they go about it in an unconventional way." Kamal stared at her, momentarily at a loss for words. This was not how he had expected this meeting to go. This woman, with her quiet dignity and unexpected wisdom, was nothing like he had anticipated. For the first time, he found himself wondering if this arrangement might bring changes he hadn't planned for. "Very well," he said, finally regaining his composure. "Marcus will handle the final contracts. When can you move in?" "I can be ready tomorrow," Sarah replied, and there was something like challenge in her smile. "After all, Mr. Haddad, I travel light these days." As Marcus led Sarah out to discuss the practical details, Kamal remained in his study, his thoughts in unusual turmoil. He had planned everything so carefully, a business transaction clean and simple. But something about Sarah Mitchell made him suspect that nothing about this arrangement would be as straightforward as he had intended. The east wing of the mansion felt like a separate world. Sarah stood in the middle of what was now her suite, surrounded by more luxury than she had seen in years. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating a sitting room larger than her old apartment, a bedroom with a view of the gardens, and a bathroom that belonged in a spa magazine. 2 weeks had passed since she moved in, and the reality of her situation was still sinking in. The medical procedures had been successful on the first try, and now she was officially carrying Kamal Haddad's child. The thought made her rest her hand unconsciously on her stomach, though it was far too early for any physical changes. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called out, expecting one of the house staff who had been unfailingly polite if somewhat distant. Instead, it was Kamal himself who entered, looking slightly uncomfortable in the more personal setting of her quarters. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell. I trust everything is satisfactory." "Please call me Sarah," she replied, gesturing to the elegant sitting area. "And yes, everything is more than satisfactory, though I have to admit I feel a bit like a character in a fairy tale." "Cinderella," Kamal suggested, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he took a seat. "More like Beauty and the Beast, locked away in a magnificent castle," Sarah returned, then immediately regretted her words. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate." But to her surprise, Kamal actually chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that transformed his usually stern face. "I've been called worse things than beast, I assure you, though I hope you don't feel locked away. You're free to use any of the public areas of the house, including the library and the gardens." "The library?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "I haven't had access to books in so long." "You enjoy reading?" "I used to read everything I could get my hands on. Medical journals, classics, modern fiction, anything that helped me understand the world better." She moved to sit across from him, her enthusiasm making her forget her usual careful reserve. Kamal studied her with newfound interest. "The library has been largely unused since I had it organized. My father believed reading fiction was a waste of time. Business journals and financial reports were the only acceptable reading material in our house." "That sounds lonely," Sarah said softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the careful barriers between them wavered. Then Kamal stood abruptly, straightening his already immaculate suit. "I came to inform you that Dr. Reynolds will be here tomorrow for your first comprehensive checkup. She's the best obstetrician in Beverly Hills, very discreet." "Thank you," Sarah replied, recognizing his retreat back to formality. Will you want to be present for the appointment?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "I hadn't considered, would that be appropriate?" "It's your child," Sarah said simply. "You have every right to be involved in these appointments." Something flickered across Kamal's face. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. "I have meetings tomorrow morning, but perhaps for the next one." As he turned to leave, Sarah called out, "Mr. Haddad?" He paused at the door. "The library? Would it be all right if I went there now?" "Of course. Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper, can show you the way." He hesitated, then added, "My father was wrong about many things, Sarah. Reading included." After he left, Sarah sat for a long moment processing their interaction. Every conversation with Kamal felt like a delicate dance. Moments of genuine connection, followed by swift retreats behind walls built over decades. But she had seen something in his eyes when she mentioned the appointments, a glimpse of the man behind the carefully constructed facade. Later that morning, as she explored the vast library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and comfortable reading nooks, Sarah found herself drawn to the business section. Among the dry financial tomes and market analyses, she discovered a collection of books on real estate development and architectural design, Kamal's professional world. On impulse, she selected one of the basic texts on real estate investment. If she was going to be carrying his child, perhaps understanding his world would help bridge the gulf between them. Besides, her pre-med studies had taught her the value of knowledge in any form. As she settled into a plush window seat with the book, Sarah noticed a small photograph that had fallen from between its pages. It showed a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, standing stiffly beside a stern-faced man in traditional Arabic dress. The boy's expression was solemn, his posture perfect, but his eyes held a sadness that Sarah recognized all too well. She carefully returned the photo to the book and placed it back on the shelf. That glimpse into Kamal's past explained more than hours of conversation could have. The lonely boy in the photograph had grown into a man who built walls around his heart, as surely as he built his real estate empire. That evening, as Sarah prepared for bed in her luxurious new surroundings, she found herself thinking about families, the one she had lost, the unconventional one she was helping to create, and the complex man who was orchestrating it all. Her hand drifted to her stomach again, and she whispered a quiet promise to the life growing within her. "You'll know love, little one. Whatever else happens, you'll know love." The morning of Sarah's first ultrasound arrived with unexpected tension in the air. Despite his earlier hesitation, Kamal had rearranged his schedule to attend, though he stood awkwardly at the periphery of the medical suite he had had installed in the mansion. Dr. Reynolds, an elegant woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of absolute competence, was reviewing Sarah's latest test results. "Your hormone levels are quite high," Dr. Reynolds remarked, studying the numbers with professional interest. "How have you been feeling?" "More tired than I expected," Sarah admitted, "and the morning sickness started early." "That's not unusual, especially given the circumstances," the doctor replied cryptically, making both Sarah and Kamal look at her sharply. "What circumstances?" Kamal asked, speaking for the first time since entering the room. Dr. Reynolds smiled, turning to the ultrasound machine. "Let's have a look, shall we? Sarah, this gel will feel a bit cold." The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of the equipment. Sarah fixed her eyes on the screen, her medical training helping her interpret the grainy images even before the doctor spoke. Her breath caught in her throat as understanding dawned. "Mr. Haddad," Dr. Reynolds said, her voice professionally calm but with an undertone of excitement, "I hope you're sitting down. You're not just having a baby, you're having 3. The silence in the room became absolute. Sarah's eyes flew to Kamal's face, watching as his usual mask of control slipped completely. He gripped the back of a nearby chair, his knuckles white. 3, he managed finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Triplets," Dr. Reynolds confirmed, pointing to the screen. "All 3 embryos successfully implanted. From what I can see, they're all developing normally. This explains the elevated hormone levels and early symptoms." Sarah lay on the examination table, her mind racing. 3 babies. She wasn't just carrying a child for Kamal, she was carrying 3. The medical implications alone were staggering, let alone the personal ones. Are they in any danger?" Kamal's question surprised them both, the concern in his voice unmistakable. "Multiple pregnancies always carry additional risks," Dr. Reynolds answered honestly. "But Sarah is young, healthy, and from what I can see, these babies are off to a strong start." However, she turned to Sarah with a serious expression, "This changes things. You'll need more rest, more frequent checkups, and a much more carefully monitored pregnancy than we initially planned." Sarah nodded, her medical knowledge filling in the details the doctor wasn't mentioning. The increased risks of complications, the likelihood of bed rest in the later stages, the possibility of early delivery. "I'll adjust the medical care, schedule and provide you with new dietary guidelines," Dr. Reynolds continued, wiping the gel from Sarah's abdomen. "Mr. Haddad, we should discuss setting up a more comprehensive medical suite here at the house. With triplets, we'll want to monitor things very closely." But Kamal seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the frozen image on the ultrasound screen. 3 tiny lives, already making their presence known, already complicating his carefully laid plans. "I'll give you 2 a moment," Dr. Reynolds said tactfully, gathering her things. "Sarah, rest for a few minutes before getting up. I'll have the new care instructions sent over this afternoon." After the doctor left, the silence stretched between them. Sarah sat up carefully, adjusting her clothing and watching Kamal's internal struggle play across his face. 3, he said finally, running a hand through his immaculate hair in an uncharacteristically nervous gesture. "The contract. We never discussed the possibility of multiples. Do you want to revise it?" Sarah asked quietly, her hand instinctively moving to protect her stomach. The question seemed to snap Kamal out of his daze. He looked at her properly for the first time since the revelation, noting her protective gesture and the hint of fear in her eyes. "No," he said firmly. "No, the contract stands. The compensation will be adjusted accordingly, of course, but—" He trailed off, moving closer to the ultrasound screen. "They're so small," he whispered, almost to himself. "But perfect," Sarah added softly. "Look at their heartbeats, strong and steady." Kamal turned to her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Thank you," he said simply. And in those two words, Sarah heard everything he wasn't saying, his fear, his hope, his overwhelming gratitude. "I should call Marcus," he said after a moment, his business persona sliding back into place. "There will need to be adjustments to the arrangements, additional security considerations." "Kamal," Sarah interrupted, using his first name for the first time. He stopped, startled by the intimacy of it. "Before you go back to treating this like a business transaction, would you like to just look at them for a moment? Your children." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them. Slowly, Kamal moved to stand beside the examination table, his attention returning to the frozen image on the screen. 3 tiny heartbeats, 3 new lives that would change everything. "My children," he repeated softly, and for just a moment, his hand reached out as if to touch the screen before dropping back to his side. "I never expected—" "Neither did I," Sarah said, a small smile playing at her lips. "But sometimes the best things in life are unexpected." As they sat there together, looking at the first picture of his children, their children in a way, Sarah realized that this journey was going to be far more complicated than either of them had imagined. But watching Kamal's carefully constructed walls begin to crack, seeing the wonder and fear warring in his eyes, she knew that complicated didn't necessarily mean bad. 3 babies. 3 times the challenge, 3 times the risk, 3 times the chance for something extraordinary to happen. The news of triplets spread through the Haddad family like wildfire, bringing with it a storm of reactions that threatened to disturb the delicate peace of the mansion. On a warm Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after the ultrasound revelation, Kamal's sister Amira swept into the house unannounced, her designer heels clicking against the marble floors with military precision. "Brother," she called out, finding Kamal in his study, "we need to talk about this situation you've created." Kamal looked up from his laptop, his expression carefully neutral. "Amira, I wasn't expecting you." "Clearly," she replied, her dark eyes scanning the room as if searching for evidence of impropriety. "The family is in an uproar. 3 children, Kamal. Through a surrogate you found on the streets. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about securing the future of our family." "Dame," he answered calmly, though his fingers tightened imperceptibly on his desk. "Isn't that what you've been pushing me to do for years? Through marriage, through a proper alliance with a suitable family." Amira's voice rose slightly. "Not through some arrangement with a homeless girl who—" "Miss Mitchell," Kamal interrupted, his tone sharp, "is a former medical student who fell on hard times. She is intelligent, dignified, and carrying my children. You will speak of her with respect." Amira stared at her brother, taken aback by his vehemence. Before she could respond, a soft knock at the door drew their attention. Sarah stood in the doorway, her simple sundress highlighting the small but noticeable curve of her stomach. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Mrs. Rodriguez asked me to remind you about the doctor's appointment this afternoon." "Sarah," Kamal said, rising from his desk, "this is my sister, Amira." Sarah stepped forward, offering a polite smile. "It's nice to meet you. Your brother has mentioned you often." Amira studied Sarah with the critical eye of someone who had spent a lifetime judging others based on appearance and breeding. To her, surprise, she found herself noting the girl's natural grace, her clear intelligence, and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. "The family has concerns," Amira said finally, her tone slightly less hostile. "Surely you understand that. For this is unconventional." "Life rarely follows convention, Mrs. Haddad," Sarah replied, Sometimes the most beautiful things come from unexpected circumstances. Poetry won't change the fact that you're carrying children who will bear our family name, Amira countered. Children who will need to be raised according to our traditions, our values. Which traditions would those be, sister? Kamal interjected, moving to stand beside Sarah. The ones that sent me to boarding school at 7? The ones that taught me that showing emotion was weakness? Those traditions? The bitterness in his voice surprised both women. Sarah instinctively placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of support. That didn't go unnoticed by Amira. I see, Amira said softly, her expression thoughtful. You're not just creating heirs, are you, brother? You're trying to create something else entirely. I'm trying to do better than what was done to me, Kamal admitted, the words seeming to surprise even him. These children, they deserve more than an empire built on emotional distance. Sarah's hand remained on his arm, her touch grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. Amira watched this subtle interaction with growing understanding. The family will talk, she warned, though her tone had lost its edge. There will be questions, judgments. Let them talk, Kamal replied firmly. My children will have everything they need, material comfort, education, opportunity, but they will also have something I never did, the chance to be loved for who they are, not what they represent. Amira looked between her brother and Sarah, seeing something she hadn't expected, a partnership forming, however unconventional it might be. You've changed, Kamal, she said finally. Perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. She turned to Sarah, her expression softening slightly. My brother is not an easy man, Miss Mitchell, but he is a good one beneath all those walls he's built. Take care of him. And those babies. After Amira left, Sarah and Kamal stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Thank you, she said finally, for defending me. You defended yourself quite capably, he replied, a hint of admiration in his voice. But you're carrying my children. You deserve to be treated with respect. Your sister's concerns aren't entirely unfounded, Sarah admitted. These children will be born into a world I know nothing about. Traditions, expectations, social obligations I can't begin to understand. Kamal turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Then we'll learn together. Because I'm beginning to think that some traditions deserve to be questioned and some expectations need to be changed. Their eyes met, and Sarah felt something shift between them, a deepening of trust, a strengthening of their unusual bond. The babies chose that moment to make their presence known, a flutter of movement that made Sarah gasp softly. What is it? Kamal asked, concern immediate in his voice. Sarah smiled, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach. Wait, there. Did you feel that? For a moment, Kamal stood perfectly still, his hand warm against the curve of her belly. Then his eyes widened as he felt the tiny movement beneath his palm. It was barely perceptible, but it was real, his children making their presence known. They're saying hello, Sarah said softly, watching the wonder spread across his face, reminding us that they don't care about family politics or social expectations. They just want to be loved. Kamal's hand lingered for a moment longer, his touch gentle. They will be, he promised, and Sarah knew he was speaking to both her and the babies. They will be loved more than they could ever imagine. Marcus Chen had always prided himself on his professional detachment. As both lawyer and friend to Kamal Haddad, he had maintained a careful balance between personal loyalty and business acumen. But watching Sarah move through the mansion's garden, her hand resting protectively on her growing belly as she studied a book on real estate development, he felt that detachment slipping. She's remarkable, isn't she? He said to Kamal, who stood beside him on the terrace, ostensibly reviewing contract modifications, but whose attention kept drifting to the woman in the garden. She's adapting well to the situation, Kamal replied neutrally, though his eyes followed Sarah's movements with an intensity that belied his casual tone. That's not what I meant, Marcus said quietly. She's transformed this place, Kamal. When was the last time you heard laughter in these halls? When was the last time you spent an evening in the library discussing books instead of business reports? Kamal shifted uncomfortably, aware of the changes his friend was pointing out. Over the past few months, Sarah had brought a warmth to the mansion that he hadn't realized was missing. Her presence had somehow made the vast spaces feel less empty, the silence less oppressive. "She's carrying my children," Kamal said, as if that explained everything. "It's natural to want her to be comfortable." "Is that all it is?" Marcus pressed, watching his friend carefully. "Because I've noticed how you look at her when you think no one's watching, how you've rearranged your schedule to be home for her, appointments, how you actually smile now, real smiles, not those corporate ones you use for business deals." "Marcus," Kamal's voice held a warning note, "don't complicate things. This arrangement is working perfectly as it is." "Is it?" Marcus turned to face his friend fully. "Because I think you're falling in love with her, whether you want to admit it or not." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Kamal's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Sarah looked up from her book and waved to them. Without thinking, Kamal raised his hand in return, a gentle smile softening his features. "I need to check on some contracts," Marcus said, patting his friend's shoulder. "Think about what I said, Kamal. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never planned for." Left alone on the terrace, Kamal watched as Sarah closed her book and made her way toward him. She moved more carefully now, her pregnancy showing, clearly at 5 months. The afternoon sun caught her hair, highlighting the natural auburn undertones that he had begun to notice more and more lately. "Your sister called," Sarah said as she reached him, settling into one of the terrace chairs. "She wants to help plan the nursery. I think she's coming around to the idea of being an aunt." "Amira always adapts eventually," Kamal replied, taking the seat beside her. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," Sarah admitted. "But good. Dr. Reynolds says all 3 are developing perfectly." She hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about something." "Oh?" "I want to take some business courses." "Online," she said, holding up the real estate book she'd been reading. "If I'm going to help these children understand their heritage, your world, I should understand it too." Kamal stared at her, caught off guard by her initiative. "You don't have to do that. The contract doesn't require—" "This isn't about the contract," Sarah interrupted gently. "It's about doing what's best for the babies. They're going to have questions someday about both sides of their heritage. I want to be able to answer them." Something warm and unexpected bloomed in Kamal's chest. The thought of Sarah wanting to understand his world, not out of obligation but out of genuine care for their children's future, touched him deeply. "I could teach you," he found himself offering. "About the business, I mean, if you're interested." Sarah's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "It would be—" Kamal searched for the right word. "Pleasant to share it with someone who wants to learn." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Then one of the babies kicked, making Sarah laugh and breaking the tension. "Here," she said, reaching for his hand. It was becoming a familiar gesture between them, sharing the baby's movements, these tiny reminders of the life they were creating together. Kamal let his hand rest on her stomach, feeling the strong movements beneath. But this time he found himself acutely aware of other things too. The warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her dress, the way her fingers lingered on his wrist, the soft catch in her breath when one of the babies kicked particularly hard. Marcus's words echoed in his mind. "You're falling in love with her." Was he? The thought should have terrified him. Love wasn't part of the plan, wasn't part of their carefully crafted arrangement. But sitting here in the late afternoon sun, feeling his children move beneath his palm while Sarah smiled up at him with those clear, honest eyes, Kamal realized that plans could change. "Tell me," he said softly, his hand still resting on her stomach. "What else would you like to learn about my world?" Sarah's answer was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Rodriguez, announcing that Dr. Reynolds had arrived early for their appointment. As they made their way back inside, Kamal found himself hyper-aware of Sarah's presence beside him, of the way she unconsciously leaned slightly toward him when she walked, of how natural it felt to place his hand at the small of her back to steady her. Marcus was right, things were changing. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The late summer heat had settled over Beverly Hills like a blanket, making the air conditioning inside the mansion feel like a blessing. Sarah sat in the library, surrounded by business textbooks and her laptop, determination written across her features despite her obvious fatigue. At 7 months pregnant with triplets, every movement had become a calculated effort, but she refused to let that slow down her studies. "You should be resting," Kamal's voice came from the doorway, concern evident in his tone. Sarah looked up, offering him a tired smile. "I will. I just want to finish this chapter on investment strategies. You know, some of these concepts remind me of organic chemistry. It's all about understanding patterns and reactions." Kamal moved into the room, noting how she had transformed his once sterile library into a warm space filled with life. Notebooks and tablets shared space with fresh flowers on the antique desk, and comfortable pillows had appeared on various chairs, making the room feel lived in and welcoming. "You're picking up the concepts remarkably quickly," he said, settling into the chair across from her. But Dr. Reynolds was very clear about the importance of rest at this stage. I know, Sarah sighed, closing her laptop. "It's just, I want to be prepared for them." She rested her hands on her prominent belly, where the triplets were particularly active today. Kamal watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Over the past months, he had witnessed her transformation from a desperate young woman into someone who approached every challenge with determination and grace. The way she was embracing his world, preparing herself to help their children navigate their future, touched him deeply. "You're already giving them more than I could have hoped for," he said softly. Sarah met his eyes, seeing the emotion he usually kept so carefully hidden. "Kamal, Suddenly she gasped, her face contorting in pain. Kamal was at her side instantly, all pretense of professional distance forgotten. "What's wrong? Should I call Dr. Reynolds?" "Something doesn't feel right," Sarah admitted, her medical training making her assessment clinical despite her fear. "The pain is different from the usual movement, and I'm feeling lightheaded." Kamal didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he had lifted her into his arms, surprising them both with the intimacy of the gesture. "We're going to the medical suite. Now." As he carried her through the mansion's corridors, Sarah found herself clinging to him, her face pressed against his shoulder. She could feel his heart racing beneath his perfectly tailored shirt, betraying his calm exterior. "I'm scared," she whispered, the admission costly to her pride, but necessary in this moment of vulnerability. Kamal's arms tightened around her. "I've got you," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you, all of you." The medical suite was already staffed, one of the many precautions Kamal had insisted upon after learning about the triplets. Within minutes, Dr. Reynolds had been called and was examining Sarah, while Kamal paced the corridor outside, his usual composure completely shattered. Marcus arrived just as Dr. Reynolds emerged from the examination room. "Preterm labor symptoms," she announced without preamble, knowing Kamal preferred directness. "We've stabilized her for now, but she'll need complete bed rest for the remainder of the pregnancy. The next few weeks are crucial." "Whatever she needs," Kamal said immediately. "Whatever it takes." Dr. Reynolds nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "She's asking for you." Inside the room, Sarah lay propped up on monitors, looking small and vulnerable against the white sheets. The sight of her there, fighting to protect their children, broke something open in Kamal's chest. "I'm sorry," she said as he approached. "I should have listened about resting more." "Shh," he soothed, taking her hand without thinking. "You have nothing to apologize for. You're the strongest person I know." Sarah's fingers tightened around his. Will you stay for a while? I know you have meetings, but..." "The meetings can wait," he interrupted. "I'm not going anywhere." Marcus, watching from the doorway, saw the way Kamal tenderly brushed a strand of hair from Sarah's face, the way she leaned into his touch, the unspoken things passing between them in looks and gentle gestures. Quietly, he stepped away to cancel his friend's appointments for the foreseeable future. Hours passed and Kamal remained by Sarah's side. They talked softly about everything and nothing, business strategies she had learned, books they had both read, hopes for the children. As night fell, Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, but Kamal stayed, watching the monitors that tracked their baby's heartbeats, strong and steady despite the day's scare. "I can't lose them," he whispered to the quiet room. "Any of them." And in that moment, he realized he wasn't just talking about the babies. Mrs. Rodriguez found him there in the morning, still holding Sarah's hand, his usually pristine suit wrinkled from sleeping in the chair. The housekeeper smiled knowingly as she brought in fresh flowers and breakfast, but Kamal was too preoccupied to notice. His world had shifted on its axis, and for the first time in his life, his carefully constructed plans seemed meaningless compared to the simple act of holding the hand of the woman who had brought such unexpected joy into his life. The babies moved under his palm where it rested protectively on Sarah's stomach, as if sensing his thoughts. 3 tiny lives and 1 remarkable woman had managed to do what decades of business success could not. They had found their way past his defenses and straight into his heart. The weeks following Sarah's health scare transformed life in the mansion. Her bedroom became the center of activity, with Kamal insisting on moving his workspace nearby so he could keep an eye on her. What started as concern slowly evolved into something deeper as they spent their days together, working side by side, sharing meals, and having long conversations about everything from business strategy to childhood dreams. "You never told me why you wanted to be a doctor," Kamal said one evening, setting aside his laptop to give Sarah his full attention. She was propped up against a mountain of pillows, looking more relaxed than she had in days. "I always wanted to help people," she replied, absently rubbing her stomach where one of the triplets was particularly active. "But it was more than that. I wanted to understand how things worked, how to fix what was broken. I guess that's why I'm so drawn to learning about your business world now. It's another way of understanding systems and making them better." Kamal watched her with growing admiration. "You could still go back to medical school, you know, after everything is settled." Sarah met his eyes, hearing the hesitation in his voice. "Would that complicate things? The arrangement?" "I think we're well past simple arrangements," Kamal admitted softly. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Before either could elaborate, Marcus arrived with his usual impeccable timing. He carried a stack of documents and a concerned expression. "The family lawyers have been asking questions," he announced without preamble. "They're concerned about the inheritance implications of triplets. The traditional agreements were designed with a single heir in mind." Kamal's expression hardened. "The children will share equally in everything. I won't have them pitted against each other the way—" He trailed off, but Sarah could fill in the blanks, the way he and his siblings had been. "It's not just about the inheritance," Marcus continued, glancing at Sarah. "There are questions about guardianship arrangements, future education plans, cultural considerations." "Cultural considerations?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Marcus looked uncomfortable. "Some family members have expressed concerns about the children's upbringing. They're questioning whether someone from outside the culture can properly prepare them for their role in the family." "That's enough," Kamal interrupted sharply, seeing the hurt flash across Sarah's face. "The children will have the best of both worlds. Sarah's determination, her compassion, her intelligence. These are exactly the qualities I want them to inherit alongside their cultural heritage." The conviction in his voice made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Marcus watched the interplay between them with growing interest. "There's something else," he said carefully. "The family is hosting their annual charity gala next month. They're expecting you to attend, Kamal, both of you." "Absolutely not," Kamal responded immediately. "Sarah needs rest. The doctors—" "I want to go," Sarah interrupted. All eyes turned to her. "Dr. Reynolds said I could do light activities as long as I'm careful. And—" she hesitated, then continued with determination. "And I want to meet your family properly. If I'm going to help these children navigate both worlds, I need to understand where they come from." Kamal studied her face, seeing the strength behind her gentle expression. "You don't have to prove anything to them." "No," she agreed, reaching for his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "But I want to prove something to myself and to our children." The word "our" sent a visible shiver through Kamal. Marcus, watching his friend's reaction, smiled knowingly. "I'll have suitable attire arranged," Kamal said finally, his thumb unconsciously stroking Sarah's hand. "But you'll stay only as long as you're comfortable, and I won't leave your side." "I never doubted that," Sarah replied softly, and the look that passed between them made Marcus feel like an intruder. Later that evening, after Marcus had left and Sarah had drifted off to sleep, Kamal stood at the window of her room, lost in thought. The woman sleeping peacefully behind him had upended every carefully laid plan, every protection he had built around his heart. He thought about the gala, about presenting Sarah to his family and social circle. They would see her as he first had, an outsider, someone beneath their social standing. But they would be wrong, just as he had been. Sarah's true worth lay not in her background or circumstances, but in her heart, her mind, and her incredible strength. Moving quietly to her bedside, Kamal adjusted her blankets, his hand lingering over the precious lives she carried. The moonlight painted her face in gentle shadows, and he found himself memorizing every detail, the curve of her cheek, the slight smile that played on her lips even in sleep, the peaceful trust with which she had welcomed him into her space. "What have you done to me?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. But as one of the babies kicked against his palm, as if in answer, he realized he already knew. This woman, these children, they had become everything. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The Haddad family's annual charity gala transformed the grand ballroom of the Beverly Wilshire into a glittering spectacle of wealth and tradition. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over elegant table settings, while soft classical music, played by a string quartet, filled the air. For Sarah, standing just outside the entrance in a custom-made midnight blue gown that elegantly draped over her pregnancy, it felt like stepping into another world. "Remember," Kamal said softly, his hand warm and steady at the small of her back, "we leave the moment you feel tired." Sarah took a deep breath, drawing strength from his presence. The past week had been filled with preparations, not just the dress and jewelry he had insisted on providing, but also careful coaching from both him and Marcus about family dynamics and social expectations. "I'm ready," she said, squaring her shoulders with quiet determination. As they entered the ballroom, Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turned toward them. She heard the whispers, saw the subtle gestures of surprise and judgment. But with Kamal beside her, his proud bearing and protective stance making it clear where he stood, she found she could face it all with grace. "Brother?" Amira approached first, elegant in emerald silk. "Sarah, you look lovely." The words seemed genuine, a marked change from their first meeting. "Come, there are people you should meet." What followed was a carefully choreographed dance of introductions and polite conversations. Sarah found herself drawing on everything. She had learned about the family business, surprising more than one guest with her knowledge of current market trends and development projects. "She's certainly done her homework," an elderly aunt remarked to Kamal in Arabic, not realizing Sarah had been studying the language. "But is that enough to raise children in our traditions?" "She has something more valuable than tradition," Kamal replied in English, making it clear he wanted Sarah to understand. "She has wisdom, compassion, and strength. Our children will learn far more from her example than from any outdated customs." The aunt's eyes widened at his defense, but before she could respond, Marcus appeared at Sarah's elbow. "May I borrow you for a dance?" he asked gallantly. "If Kamal doesn't mind?" Kamal hesitated for a fraction of a second, something flashing in his eyes that made Sarah's heart skip. But he nodded graciously, knowing a dance with his trusted friend would be seen as acceptable by the watching crowd. As Marcus led her in a careful waltz, mindful of her condition, he spoke quietly. "You've impressed them, you know, not just with your knowledge, but with your dignity, the way you carry yourself, the way you've embraced Kamal's world while maintaining your own identity. It's exactly what this family needs." "You make it sound like I planned this," Sarah replied, matching his quiet tone. "Didn't you?" Marcus's eyes twinkled. "Fall in love with him?" Sarah missed a step, but Marcus smoothly covered for her. That wasn't part of the arrangement," she whispered. No, he agreed, but it's what happened. To both of you, whether you've admitted it to each other or not. Before Sarah could respond, she felt a familiar flutter of movement, stronger than usual. She gasped softly, her hand going to her stomach. Kamal was at her side instantly, as if he had been watching for any sign of distress. "Sarah, I'm fine," she assured him quickly. "They're just very active tonight. I think they're dancing too." Without hesitation, Kamal took her from Marcus, drawing her into his arms in a slow dance that was more of an embrace than a formal step. The watching crowd faded away as they moved together, his hand splayed protectively over her stomach where their children moved beneath. "You're amazing," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "Do you know that? Everything you've done, everything you've become, you've surpassed every expectation I ever had." Sarah looked up at him, seeing the emotion usually hidden behind his controlled facade. It's easy to exceed expectations when you're given a chance to show who you really are. Their eyes met and held, the moment stretching between them filled with unspoken feelings. Around them the crowd watched with varying degrees of approval and concern, but neither noticed. They were lost in their own world, one that had been building slowly over months of shared moments and growing understanding. "Kamal," Sarah started, her voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you." A sharp pain cut through her words, making her grip his arms tightly. This wasn't like the movement before. This was different, more intense. "Something's wrong," she managed, her medical training warring with rising panic. "The babies." Kamal's face paled, but his actions were immediate and decisive. In moments, he had lifted her into his arms, ignoring the gasps and murmurs from the crowd. Marcus was already on the phone to Dr. Reynolds, while Amira cleared a path to the exit. As they rushed from the ballroom, Sarah pressed her face into Kamal's shoulder, drawing comfort from his steady heartbeat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I wanted so much to prove I could belong in your world." "How you belong in my world," Kamal replied fiercely, holding her closer as they reached the waiting car. "You and our children, you are my world now. Everything else is just details." The last thing Sarah remembered before the pain overwhelmed her was the look in his eyes as he said those words, a look that told her everything she needed to know about where she truly belonged. The private medical suite of the mansion had never felt more alive than it did in the early hours of that morning. After hours of careful monitoring and expert care from Dr. Reynolds, the sound of 3 distinct cries filled the air, strong, healthy, and perfectly timed at 34 weeks, just mature enough to thrive. Kamal, still in his formal wear, from the gala, though considerably more disheveled, stood transfixed by the sight before him. Sarah lay propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding one of their daughters, while 2 nurses tended to the other babies nearby. "Would you like to hold her?" Sarah asked softly, nodding to the precious bundle in her arms. He moved forward almost in a trance, his usual grace forgotten as he carefully accepted the tiny infant. The baby girl blinked up at him with eyes that already seemed wise beyond their minutes, and something in his chest contracted almost painfully. "She has your strength," he whispered, touching one perfect tiny hand with his finger. "They all do." Sarah smiled, watching him fall in love with their daughter. "And your determination, did you hear them? Not one of them waited for the others. They all decided to arrive at exactly the same moment. Just like their mother," Kamal said, his voice rough with emotion, making dramatic entrances and changing everything. The nurses brought over the other 2 babies, another girl and a boy, settling them carefully in bassinets beside Sarah's bed. All 3 infants were small but healthy, their early arrival having been managed perfectly by the medical team Kamal had assembled. "I've been thinking," Sarah said after a moment, her voice careful, "about the contract." Kamal's head snapped up, fear flickering across his features before he could hide it. "Sarah, let me finish," she interrupted gently. "I know what we agreed, that after the births I would take the compensation and start my new life, but watching you with them, seeing how much love you have to give." She paused, gathering her courage. "I don't want to leave." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Kamal stood perfectly still, the baby in his arms making tiny, contented sounds. "I've spent months preparing to be part of their lives from a distance," Sarah continued, "learning about your world, your business, your family's traditions, but somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't just doing it for them anymore. I was doing it because I wanted to be part of your world, part of your life." Kamal moved closer to her bed, his movements careful with their precious cargo. "What are you saying, Sarah?" She met his eyes directly, showing the same courage that had first impressed him months ago. "I'm saying I love you, Kamal Haddad. Not your money, not your position, but you, the man who reads business reports to his unborn children, who learned every detail about prenatal development, who holds my hand through every doctor's appointment, even though it terrifies you." Kamal's breath caught in his throat. With infinite care, he placed their daughter in her bassinet, then turned back to Sarah. His hands were trembling slightly as he took hers. "I had this all planned," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A perfect business arrangement. No complications, no emotions, just a simple transaction to secure an heir." He laughed softly, the sound full of wonder. "And then you walked into my life and shattered every wall I'd built. You showed me what real strength looks like, what real love could be." "Is that a yes?" Sarah asked, her eyes bright with tears and hope. "You want us to stay?" Instead of answering directly, Kamal reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this for weeks, trying to find the courage to break our contract first." Sarah gasped as he opened the box, revealing a stunning emerald ring. Not a traditional diamond, but something as unique as their relationship. "This isn't about the contract anymore," Kamal said softly. "This is about love, about family, about building something real together. Stay with me, Sarah. Help me raise our children, run our business, create the kind of home I never had growing up. Marry me not because of duty or tradition, but because somehow, in the midst of our careful plans, we found something extraordinary." "Yes," Sarah whispered, tears flowing freely now. "Yes, to all of it." As Kamal slipped the ring onto her finger, one of the babies let out a small cry, followed quickly by the other two, as if they too were celebrating this moment of perfect clarity, this transformation of a business arrangement into something far more precious. Marcus, who had been quietly watching from the doorway, smiled to himself as he witnessed the scene. He saw Kamal bend to kiss Sarah, saw the way they both looked at their children with such love, and knew that sometimes the best contracts were the ones that were meant to be broken. In the years that followed, the Haddad mansion would be transformed. The once quiet halls would ring with children's laughter, the formal rooms would be softened with toys and family photos, and the library would become a place where business lessons merged seamlessly with bedtime stories. And if anyone in the family or social circle had doubts about the unconventional way Kamal had created his family, they were silenced by the obvious joy and love that filled the house. Because in the end, it wasn't about tradition or propriety or careful plans. It was about two people who had the courage to let love rewrite their story, and three precious babies who helped make it happen.